Last time we discussed the following idea. In studying history geopolitically, we must consider not only what happened, but also what didn't. That's because geopolitics is fundamentally modeled on games like Go or chess. What if the leaders had made different choices at key moments? How would history have unfolded? That's the basis for analysis. This is how geopolitical thinking is fundamentally structured. Then that's what makes it so engaging. Here's the Korean War. At first, we were overwhelmingly pushed back. Eventually, the defense line was pushed all the way down to Daegu and Busan. Then MacArthur carried out the dramatic Incheon landing and began the counter-offensive northward. Strategists like Henry Kissinger later reflected on this moment. Here's the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. Wonsan is located around here. If the troops had stopped at the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, just paused there and had demanded a ceasefire at that point, it could have been a highly favorable outcome. At that time, in terms of population, our ancestors living on the Korean peninsula, that line would have secured 80% of the peninsula's population, leaving just 20% outside it. Even today, there are few major cities north of Pyongyang. This kind of buffer was crucial, and the reason is, though the US was at war, it needed to send a signal to China. It was telling the Chinese, we have no intention of invading you. So a clear boundary could have been drawn right there. What we discussed last time was that, instead the war dragged into a 2-year stalemate, trench warfare in the hills. But what if the line had just been drawn clearly at Pyongyang-Wonsan? What do you think would have happened? The great powers' chessboard would have frozen right there. And in fact, it has remained frozen for the past 70 years. Since then, we've had spies coming down, and constant internal turmoil, but it's all just another version of that trench warfare. If we'd seen it from this angle, we might think, oh, that wasn't such a big deal after all. Still, we had to play our roles within that confined space. I hesitate to call it acting, but it was a kind of role play we had no choice but to perform. The great powers likely intended for things to stop right there. How you interpret this affects the depth of your understanding of Korea today. Your grasp of today's reality hinges on this. Now, the first hypothetical is this. 15 years later, Kissinger rewrote his book, and he said, this isn't what I thought I knew. As I mentioned last time, many classified Soviet and Chinese records had since been declassified, so now materials from the 60s and 70s offer new perspectives. At one point, even serious Korean intellectuals believed the South had invaded the North, thanks to revisionist theories. But once the documents were released, that debate was over. It was clearly a northern invasion, but on whether China was planning its intervention, Kissinger revised his position. Because China had intended to intervene from the very beginning. Today's focus is on China. Just as American strategists were obsessed with Vietnam, the widely accepted theory that China intervened because MacArthur advanced too quickly and China felt threatened is now being challenged. Because recently declassified Chinese documents show they were already prepared. They say things like this. Mao said that if US forces stopped at the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, the narrowest stretch of the peninsula, then from the US Army's perspective, which lacked strength on land, it would be the most defensible position. That line is the shortest across the entire peninsula. Mao gave the following instruction to Peng Dehuai. If needed, we can delay 6 months. Use that time to prepare thoroughly before moving in. That's what he said. Why would China have moved in even if the US hadn't gone that far? Because China, our immediate neighbor, is the true constant in our geopolitical reality. If we can just understand China properly, it will greatly reduce the likelihood of strategic failure in our own lives. Understanding China alone goes a long way. China is a permanent variable in our equation, an ever-present force. That's why 15 years later, Kissinger changed his view in his book on China. And that revision was correct. That's also consistent with the books I've read. When you look at the declassified records, it's clear that China had coordinated from the very beginning, nearly from day one. And that's actually quite strange. China had just won the Chinese Civil War in 1949. That was 1949, and just 1 year later, when Kim Il-sung stirred things up, they prepared to come down. At that moment, China resolved to enter the war, so their decision wasn't dependent on what the US did or didn't do. In fact, it was Kim Il-sung who initially tried to stop them from intervening. Kim Il-sung thought, I can handle this on my own. Mao isn't necessary. Even when he had pushed all the way down to Daegu and Busan, Mao kept sending troops to Manchuria, watching for an opportunity to enter. But Kim Il-sung kept pushing back, saying no. Only after suffering defeats did Kim finally request Chinese support. Second point, since the 1990s, in terms of inter-Korean competition, this systemic rivalry between North and South, almost no one thinks the two are neck and neck. For example, during the 1990s, Sunshine Policy, Korea's version of detente, even within pro-North or pro-socialist circles in South Korea, they were saying, North Korea has no real power left. They're powerless. Just give them oil and let them survive. And they're not serious about nuclear weapons. It's just for negotiation, right? But let's think about this. If we had drawn the line at Pyongyang Wonsan like this, looking at everything that unfolded afterward, South Korea's democratization, industrialization, we tend to think all of that would have progressed more smoothly. But here's the real question. Since the 1990s, in this systemic competition with the South, has North Korea, already far behind, really been okay? At this point, does it really matter whether North Korea is here or there on the map? They've got nuclear facilities anyway, right here. So I believe that assumption was flawed too. Each nation has a distinct identity. Just as individuals have their own personalities, so too do countries have national character. The US, for example, has this strange creature called idealism, something rare in other countries. But we also have our own identity, something distinctly Korean. And I believe the Korean War played a central role in shaping it. When people say Koreans are kind of unusual or Koreans are remarkably driven, there's something to that. Much of that national character stems from the Korean War. You should read this novel. It's called The House with a Sunken Courtyard, written by Kim Won-il, who was my literary mentor, though I don't mean that I received personal training from him. He's a very well-known author. Reading that novel really helps you understand the Korean people. It helps you understand your parents, your grandparents. In The House with a Sunken Courtyard, the story takes place in Daegu in 1954. It's a portrait of relentless, almost infinite positivity toward life. Our elder generations, not everyone of course, but it reflects something deeply rooted in our national character, Bukeo. It's an extreme form of life affirmation, almost radical positivity. But not because life is fun or feels like a trip to an amusement park. Life was truly brutal. The circumstances were ugly, unbearable. It was survival for the sake of survival. And yet they never questioned it. They never doubted life's value. In a country shaped by 600 years of Joseon-era ideology, this was never part of the national ethos. We must live well, but it became everyone's shared dream. It was declared national policy. Let's eat our fill and live with dignity. This desire is deeply embedded in us. You might not even realize it. But it also has a darker side, right? Why do we have expressions like that perfect son of my mom's friend? Everything must be shown off to you. You have to boast, to display, to perform. In the book, The House with a Sunken Courtyard, there's the mother and older sister and the main character, Nam-il. Then there's the youngest, born during the war, and he ends up developmentally disabled. The mother is a young widow. This is actually an autobiographical novel by Kim Won-il, his father being an intellectual defected to North Korea. So, in the story, the father is barely mentioned. It's only hinted at while the mother tells the children he simply died in the war. She's a young widow who supports her family by sewing with a manual sewing machine. But whose clothes was she sewing exactly? She was sewing clothes for Yanggongju, Korean women who worked as hostesses for U.S. soldiers. These women worked near the U.S. military base in Daegu, entertaining American servicemen stationed there. So that's the social backdrop of the novel. Stark and deeply symbolic. Just managing to eat 3 meals a day was a daily war. Modern Korean family structure isn't rooted in the Joseon dynasty. It was shaped by the survival battles of post-war mothers. And that's how Korea became a matrifocal society. Even though so many men died in the war, what the next generation remembers most isn't their sacrifice and not the fathers' sacrifices for the nation, but the raw, desperate fight of mothers to keep their children alive. This is why families in South Korea in particular became emotionally centered around the mother, forming a matriarchal core. This is why Korean feminism differs from the Western model that's rooted in universal rights discourse. That difference has also become a source of gender conflict toward men, whether older brothers, younger brothers, husbands. Korean women carry what you could call a perpetual bond claim on them. And honestly, there's a reason that mindset exists. It stems from the immense sacrifices made by their mothers. Now, I don't know whether this next story is entirely true or a composite of multiple tales, but it's a story that's often told. A taxi driver in the 1970s once shared this. At Gimpo Airport, a strong young Korean man hailed his cab and in broken Korean asked to be taken to a place in Gangwon province. He gave a very specific location, probably Cheolwon. It was winter, but despite the cold weather, the driver took him there anyway. When they arrived, the man asked, "Can you wait here? I won't be long." "Sure," the driver said. He was planning to drive him back to Seoul. But then the young man walked into a snow-covered mountain valley and began taking off his clothes piece by piece. Wearing nothing but his underwear, he lay down in the snow. And then he began to sob, deep, uncontrollable sobs. Here's the story behind it. During the Korean War, an American soldier patrolling that area came across a female corpse in the snow. She was completely naked. In her arms, wrapped in her own clothes, was a baby, still alive. The baby had survived. So the soldier took the child and raised him in the United States. The child, knowing he was adopted, probably asked why he looked so different from his parents. They told him he was adopted, and when he was old enough to understand, his adoptive father likely explained how he had come into the world. So piecing together his father's fragmented memories, he returned to that snowy mountain in winter. We don't know if this story is entirely true or slightly embellished, but the sentiment appears in the book, The House with a Sunken Courtyard, too. That generation survived by consuming their mother's blood, flesh, and sacrifice. That's how they made it through. So when I was in college, drinking with friends, we were 90s kids, already grown, but whenever someone mentioned their mom, we'd all end up quietly sobbing. If you want to know what mother means to our generation, it may be a bit different from your generation's understanding, but I highly recommend reading The House with a Sunken Courtyard by Kim Won-il. After that, Korea became a matrifocal society. You're not like the students who live upstairs. They've got both parents, a home, and plenty to eat. What would they have to envy? If they study hard, they'll graduate from a good college and land a good job. With money and connections, they'll succeed faster than others. Even if you work twice as hard as the kids upstairs, the gap might never close and you could end up exactly where you started. But when it's drought season, a farmer staring at the sky won't magically get food on the table. So even if you spend your life looking up at the people upstairs, you still have to try. Do whatever you can with all you've got. As long as you and your siblings grow up right, make a decent living, and aren't looked down upon. Isn't that enough for lives like ours, going uphill on a downhill road? This mother, the one working the sewing machine, had left her son Gilnam with her family in the war-torn countryside for a while, but brought him back so he could take the middle school entrance exam. She brought him to the city, but couldn't afford to send him to school. He did eventually enroll, likely in a night commercial school. During the day, the mom gave him some seed money and sent him off to sell newspapers. And these are the words she said to him. The reason I share these passages, We've been studying the United States, right? Americans embrace a kind of idealism that feels unfamiliar to us. In this context, upstairs refers to the landlord's family living upstairs. The father was a government official and had connections with the US military. They even hosted parties, lived a different kind of life. Meanwhile, downstairs, you find all kinds of family structures, all of them broken in some way. There are hardly any intact families down there. It's a story about multiple generations of fractured families living in the lower quarters. The upstairs refers to the students growing up upstairs. From below, they seem endlessly out of reach. They live without worry. Just follow what their parents tell them and study. They could easily go to middle and high school. That's who these upstairs kids are. And as you read this, can you even believe it? In 1954, just after living through 600 years of rigid social hierarchy, a caste system nearly unparalleled in modern global history, where did this sense of equality even come from? Think about Gilnam's mother in the novel. Does she sound like she's saying, your fate is different, so be content with less? Or does she sound more like this? Because you started behind, you'll have to run like hell just to catch up. Run like your life depends on it. Is it the former or the latter? It's clearly the latter. To you, this mindset might feel obvious because you already live with this kind of consciousness. But this is where Koreans and Japanese fundamentally differ. We don't believe it's over until it's completely over. We keep playing the game to the very end. Japan, on the other hand, when you finish high school in a rural area, you're either Tokyo University material or you're not. And that's it. The game ends right there. You see it in Japanese novels and literature. It's portrayed as final. That resignation is a common narrative. But in Korea, even if someone goes to a college with a lower ranking, they keep comparing all the way. They compare apartment size, their kids' careers, everything. Even if it's twisted, they must compare. That's our emotional fabric. That's Korean culture. We never concede the game doesn't end, not until we die. So again, where did this fierce sense of equality come from? Imagine this. Half of our ancestors were slaves. Half. From a deeply rooted caste system that lasted 600 years. How did this mindset emerge? You and the upstairs kids may have started differently, but this isn't over. Work hard, run till the end, even if that end is your death. That's the grit we live with. Isn't that astonishing? Now, in the US, idealism tends to be more utopian, almost dreamy. Look at how young Americans talk about climate change and our gender issues. They try to realize ideals that are almost religious in nature in their society. But in our case, it's about equality, I think. Equality for us is practically a doctrine. We're not really interested in material equality. It's ideological, even metaphysical, a kind of religious belief in equality. In a good light, that belief is our strength, our dynamism. We never accept defeat. We push through to the very end. But when it turns toxic or is weaponized, it can tear society apart. Just as America wouldn't be America without idealism, that idealism is also part of what makes the US so compelling, its very identity. We Koreans have something similar, and how we manage this deep hunger for equality is one of our biggest challenges. No other country reacts as fiercely as Korea does when a chaebol heir goes astray, where the entire nation boils with rage. And what underlies that is this collective feeling. You come here after work, tired and drained, but striving for a degree. You are living that ideal. Just like Gilnam's mom said, selling newspapers during the day, studying at night. That's Gilnam's story. Isn't that incredible? It has both admirable and problematic aspects. There are parts of Korean identity we find horrifying, but when I look at our mother's generation, what I've realized in preparing this lecture is, compared to them, our generation, and the one below us, we are embarrassingly weak. Even the upstairs kids in that novel lived harder lives than we do today. Read the book. All they had was 3 meals a day, barely. In school, they didn't even have to sell newspapers. But if we tell our kids today, I can't get you fruit every day or send you to private lessons, but you're not starving. And I'm not making you work, so study hard. Will they say, wow, my parents are amazing? If we say that radical positivity came out of war, it sounds grotesque, but it's not unrelated. That infinite affirmation of life extreme positivity, that's our generational identity. So if you're struggling, read The House with a Sunken Courtyard. And you'll realize what I'm going through is nothing. I know, we suddenly veered from geopolitics into literature. Now picking up from last time, what sort of messes has American idealism gotten the world into? This was a highly organized communist and nationalist force. The other side was extremely mixed. There were Buddhist groups and those who had cooperated with the French colonizers, similar to what we'd call pro-foreign collaborators in Korea. There were pro-Americans too, as in religious groups as well. When there were Catholics, heavily influenced by the French, all of these diverse and conflicting elements made up South Vietnam. And when Buddhism rose up as a powerful voice, President Ngo Dinh Diem was a devout Catholic. Tensions escalated dramatically, there were self-immolations and nationwide chaos. Kennedy, unable to tolerate it any longer, ordered him removed, and the military assassinated him. I showed you that photo last time. It was a vicious cycle, a devastating one. Kissinger criticized this sharply. Because in countries like Vietnam, which had never truly functioned as a unified state, when multiple factions are loosely bound together, you can't impose Western-style democracy and expect harmony. Someone has to bind it all with an iron fist first. This is where the US always fails. They've never succeeded in this kind of scenario. Nation building takes time. You need state consolidation and internal order first. Then comes economic development. Only then do you think about human rights and democratization. That's the order it must follow. And that's the path we Koreans took. We don't even need to look at other countries. We're living proof of that trajectory. Even Syngman Rhee suppressed Buddhism. Had someone called for his assassination? Well, our country would have spiraled into total chaos. We know all too well how these vicious cycles unfold. Hanoi continued to sow chaos, sending down Viet Cong to prevent any social stabilization. Vietnam's geography is similar to the Korean peninsula, okay? But unlike Korea, Vietnam had Laos and Cambodia next door. The US Navy couldn't enter Laos and Cambodia. Only ground troops could go in, but they were neutral countries, so the US tried to conduct delicate operations, partly because of memories of the Korean War. This became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It passed through Laos and Cambodia, allowing Viet Cong to stream southward. Each year, not only were many US soldiers killed, they assassinated some 2,500 South Vietnamese civil servants annually. Imagine if 1,000 civil servants were assassinated annually in South Korea today. In that kind of environment, any political activity would be carried out under a threat to survival. Can you imagine forming a middle-class, civil society-based party system under those conditions? Expecting that would be madness. So here's what Nixon did. While initiating detente with China, he expanded the war into Cambodia. It wasn't a war Nixon started. In fact, he ended it. But people still condemn him because he expanded the war into Cambodia. It was all because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in 1978, long after Nixon had stepped down. Oxford invited Nixon to speak, and it's a fascinating video. Watching it makes you reconsider Nixon's character. You may see him in a new light. Because people treat Nixon as a villain. The protest outside was so loud and constant, it was hard to hear inside. People were shouting to get out, die Nixon. But inside, he gave his speech. During the debate-style Q&A, someone asked, why did you expand the war into Cambodia? Do you regret it? Nixon gave a compelling explanation for why expansion into Cambodia was necessary. According to Nixon, he had King Sihanouk's permission. That was news to me. He said the king didn't care. There were hardly any Cambodians there. The area was overrun by North Vietnamese communists operating as guerrillas. The Vietnam War differed fundamentally from the Korean War. America entered to preserve its moral reputation, but ended up losing that moral reputation entirely. This wasn't the case in the Korean War. Though many US soldiers died in Korea, there was some domestic backlash, but mostly among elites. The general public was still quite idealistic. Since we've started this, we better win. Why are those weak elites losing? What stalemate? Just crush the Chinese commies. That was the dominant public sentiment. But Vietnam was the complete opposite. People began to ask, is this really America? That's how much public opinion flipped. Withdraw at all costs. That became the rallying cry of student protesters. The Vietnam War didn't start like the Korean War. It didn't begin with a sudden dramatic invasion. It escalated slowly, skirmish by skirmish with the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong included local communists, but mostly they were North Vietnamese fighters operating in South Vietnam. Because of their Korean War experience, Americans hesitated to strike Hanoi directly. They limited themselves to air raids, nothing more. And even those came after opening detente with China. Then Nixon finally escalated operations, but the fighting continued in the South. They were haunted by the MacArthur mindset, Pyongyang Wonsan syndrome, if you will. Had it been MacArthur, he'd have stormed Tonkin, taken a chunk of North Vietnam, and then negotiated. More like, you want to talk? Sit down now. But they feared China would intervene again. China again? No way. So the US focused solely on fighting in South Vietnam and got stuck in a prolonged quagmire. Just because you gain geopolitical insight from one case, either you can't apply it wholesale. The geography was completely different. People like Khrushchev and the Chinese defense minister Yue Nishpa were watching closely as the US struggled in Vietnam. We will encircle industrial society through third world revolutions. When they heard that, American presidents took it seriously. Literally. They thought, if we push north, or launch an amphibious assault, China will intervene. But after detente with China, it became clear that China never intended to intervene in this case. It was the complete opposite of the Korean War. And that's the irony of history. The common view was that MacArthur went too far and provoked China. But that's not true. China intended to come in all along. In Vietnam, China had no intention of getting involved, no matter what the US did. But America didn't realize that. There was a man named Edgar Snow. He had followed the Chinese during the Long March and wrote Mao's biography in English. He was essentially a Mao enthusiast, an American journalist. When China was isolated, they kept inviting Edgar Snow, done signaling to the US with metaphorical yellow handkerchiefs. Talk to us! But in America, even though Snow was American, nobody paid attention. Of course he says that. He's a Maoist. The media failed in its responsibility. This was 1965, early in the Vietnam War. Mao told Snow, "We enjoy bluffing and saber-rattling, but we won't actually send troops." That's what Mao said to Edgar Snow. He dropped a lot of hints. We're not getting involved in Vietnam. Actually, America messing up Vietnam isn't so bad for us. After World War II, during the Korean War, the Soviets gained way too much ground. Eastern Europe fell, China fell, and if the Korean Peninsula fell too, it would have been disastrous. So China intervened in Korea out of fear of being encircled. Vietnam was the complete opposite. After the Korean War reached stalemate, Soviet expansion was largely halted, and America regained its confidence. You could say it was overconfidence that led to the Vietnam War. They thought they could manage Vietnam with Korean War lessons, fine-tuning strategy as needed. But this is exactly what idealists miss. In war, there is no such thing as micro-adjustment. Think about it. In the Korean War for 2 years, we lost countless lives fighting over meaningless hills just to reach an armistice. And the soldiers fighting those battles, this is just a tactical chess match. It's not strategic. This won't decide a nation's fate. None of this is really our doing anyway. You think that's what they were thinking in battle? To those soldiers, every skirmish, and doesn't each battle demand full devotion and sometimes life itself? Not like what people sitting around a table think. Once war begins, there's no such thing as micro-adjustment. You just get dragged deeper and deeper into the chaos. Now here's another key difference. In the Korean War, the Truman administration had turned realist, and Eisenhower followed with conciliation, while the public was hawkish. So to China and the USSR, the people we're negotiating with look better than the alternative. The public and the opposition are even more terrifying, but the Vietnam War, complete opposite. Protesters surrounded the White House demanding immediate and total withdrawal. So from North Vietnam's perspective, God must be on our side. America is basically collapsing. Mao was preparing detente with the US, yet even he hesitated. Is America about to collapse in revolution? He wondered if a communist revolution was underway in America. So Mao summoned the head of the Australian Communist Party to ask, is the US going through a revolution? Because Mao saw the current US government as right-wing. He was planning detente with that very right-wing administration. And now thought, wait, is a revolutionary regime about to take over? That's how chaotic things were because of Vietnam. Amid all that, Nixon managed to lead negotiations. Remarkable, really. So why doesn't Nixon get credit for that? There are many reasons. Part of it lies in Nixon's own character. He was obsessively secretive. And in the end, that secrecy became his downfall. He had wiretaps all over the White House. Yes, he recorded conversations. So did Eisenhower and others before him. But the Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes. He didn't want to hand them over, so he resigned instead. So why was he so obsessed with secrecy? Well, the circumstances forced his hand. If he didn't operate in total secrecy, strategically, he couldn't even play the game. As I said last time, America's a democracy. Tell the public, and you tell your enemies too. I'm planning detente with China to strike Cambodia. That's basically announcing the whole war plan, game over. Everything had to be secret, but the press was desperate to uncover something. When Kissinger was Secretary of State, info kept leaking. Nixon told Kissinger, find the spies on your team. Kissinger went through everyone and found that his own secretary was leaking. Neither Kissinger nor Nixon could trust anyone. He tried to bring the Chinese giant to his side to end the war on his own terms with honor because it was a humiliating situation. He wanted to end the war with dignity, and secrecy was the only way. Even inside the White House, only a handful knew what was happening. It got to the point where on his secret flight to China, since it was all top secret, China's own Coast Guard, unaware of the visit, thought it was an intruder and asked, do we shoot it down? That's how risky it was to pull off detente with China. But Nixon's secrecy was more than the American press could tolerate. So eventually the East Coast liberals joined hands with the Jacksonians, who basically said, we don't owe you anything. Just come back if you want, on our terms. So when Nixon signed the peace accords in Paris with North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese were genuinely afraid of him. Nixon's a madman. If he says he'll bomb Hanoi, he'll do it. They feared Hanoi would be wiped out, so they signed, agreeing not to threaten South Vietnam. But as soon as Nixon resigned, idealists took over Congress and started drafting all kinds of strange legislation, laws that tied the military's hands completely. President Ford pleaded with them not to go that far, but no one listened. Ford wasn't even elected. He was Nixon's VP. You're lucky you're not gone too. So they ignored Ford, and North Vietnam moved in. They thought, America's finished, and just marched down. And the very thing Eastern elites attacked Nixon for, his ambiguity, his secrecy, was actually the cornerstone of his diplomatic strategy. That's straight from Kissinger's book, but they shattered that call. And so in the end, with US troops gone, the locals who had helped the Americans now faced being labeled collaborators and killed by the Viet Cong. Only a few were selected. Look how many people are waiting for that tiny helicopter. That helicopter was the last to leave. A president who puts American interests first. You may think Trump was the first, but Nixon was there before him. There were a few before Nixon too, but rare. Here's what Nixon said. Foreign policy must be grounded in a realistic assessment of the interests of those who are not like us. That's when we're most effective. We do not engage with the world because of promises. We make promises because we are engaged. Our interests justify our commitments, not the other way around. Even when we fight wars like in Vietnam, it's not out of altruism, it's about American national interest. That's what he told Congress, both the House and Senate. Surprisingly, America has idealists on both the left and right. But they all hate one thing, acknowledging that foreign policy is based on national self-interest. They especially hate hearing it come from a president's mouth. But Nixon said it plainly, even shamelessly. This shows you something about America. Isn't it obvious a president should prioritize their nation's interests? That's the nuance behind America First. Think about it. Would that even work as a presidential campaign slogan in Korea? I'll be a president who puts Korea's interests first. It just doesn't sound quite right as a Korean political slogan. We'd think, well, obviously, why even say that? But in America, it was so non-obvious that Trump gained huge traction with America First in 2016. People miss the context and only focus on the phrase itself. That narrowness of understanding is the problem. When Trump said America First, I thought, why state the obvious? Then it hit me. In America, that's not a given. Look at other countries. I'm here to serve my nation's interest. Would that ever be a political slogan? Now let's talk about US-China detente. You've heard of ping-pong diplomacy, right? There was a table tennis championship in Japan. This was during the Cultural Revolution. China was totally isolated and a bit crazy. A poor, erratic, but gutsy China appeared on the global stage for the first time, and it was in Japan. They ended up playing a match against the US. Some exchange happened, maybe a towel or gesture of goodwill. Then Mao invited the American team to China. They played a match in China, and Nixon welcomed them back at the White House. Then someone said, "Mr. President, Chairman Mao would like to meet you." Then Nixon went, "Sure, why not?" So the legend became ping pong players changed the course of history. That's a myth, a fairy tale. It was just a stage, something for the world to see. Directed by Mao, starring Nixon and Zhou Enlai. If we strip away the fairy tale and look at real history, before becoming president, Nixon wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine. In the long run, we simply cannot leave China forever outside the family of nations. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion people to live in angry isolation. That was Nixon writing in Foreign Affairs, back in 1967. As I mentioned earlier, by 1965, Mao had already summoned Edgar Snow. He was already signaling reconciliation. We won't intervene in Vietnam. He dropped hints again and again, but America didn't pick up on it. Only after detente did the US realize. Mao had already decided as early as 1965 that China needed to join hands with America. That's how insane the Cultural Revolution was. The movement was driven by middle school students. They stopped going to school and started strikes. They stripped General Secretary Liu Shaoqi naked and beat him to death. It was unbelievably brutal, pure chaos. They were anti-intellectual and anti-elite. They stormed the foreign ministry and declared China doesn't need diplomacy. Strangely, Egypt was the only exception. Every other Chinese ambassador was recalled to China. They were sent down to rural farms, raising pigs literally. So there were no diplomatic channels left with China. That's what the Cultural Revolution did. Purged its own diplomats. Still, contact continued through unofficial back channels. Even after Nixon took office, China kept sending subtle signals. But here's the problem. Mao had said, anyone who even slightly supports capitalism, execute them. He launched the Cultural Revolution. He was at the center of it. So for Mao, the father of the revolution, not to be seen as a revisionist time and then shake hands with the demonized Nixon by his own initiative. That was politically impossible. Okay, Nixon and Kissinger already knew that making detente with China would flip the global board from a chess match into a game of Go. It was their last shot at a grand strategic victory. Meanwhile, 300 American soldiers were dying daily in Vietnam. Everyone knew China was backing North Vietnam. So Nixon couldn't publicly say, let's make peace with China. Even though both sides were exchanging friendly letters, they were still arguing over the wording of the invitation. So Mao came up with the idea, ping-pong diplomacy. No official invitation, no official host, and yet the capitalist leader and communist leader shook hands. The ping-pong match was just the setup. That's what that era was like. You may not fully grasp it now, but that was reality back then. These are Kissinger's words. Thus, confrontation made no sense for either side. Wasn't it because of the confrontation that we came to Beijing in the first place? Nixon sought to expand America's vision beyond Vietnam. Mao's decision was to act before the USSR could threaten China militarily, forcing them to hesitate. Neither side could afford failure in this delicate moment. They both knew what was at stake, so the US and China had to join hands, and this alliance was stronger than we often assume. In fact, the world we live in today is geopolitically shaped by the US-China relationship. And that happened in 1971 and 1972. We were this close to becoming North Korea. At that moment, South Korea also landed on the geopolitical chessboard. At the time, Kissinger was the president's national security advisor, and he was secretly dispatched to China. He told Zhou Enlai the following. The US military presence on the Korean peninsula is not permanent. That's what he said. Zhou replied, yeah, just leave the Americans there. Detente with China was so crucial that Kissinger basically said, if you want, we'll withdraw from Korea. But Zhou responded, no, it's better to keep US troops in Korea. Why? One of China's nightmares is Russia and Japan forming an alliance. Since China can't deploy troops to Korea, and lacks power in that region, US forces help preserve the status quo, and that's beneficial to China. That was true during the Korean War, but by the Vietnam War, America was on the verge of collapse. Then Nixon flipped the board in one move. They shifted the strategic narrative. This is what political geniuses do. Kissinger and Nixon, true strategic masterminds. What did these two geniuses do? Everyone thought the US was playing chess, but suddenly they swapped the board for Go. We were playing Go all along, they revealed. And the game flipped. All the chess kings and pieces fell. Even America's own kings were toppling. Nixon himself was brought down. Yet afterward, the post-Vietnam order made the US the unchallenged global power. When Zhou Enlai met Kissinger, he said, "This remained China's message until Xi Jinping shifted course. China consistently conveyed this to the world. To bring about true detente over the long term on the global stage, we must all treat one another as equals." The fact that a Chinese leader said this is significant, but what did China say to Korea during the THAAD dispute? A small country like yours should obey a great power like us. The second message is also important. Even as our economy grows, we won't see ourselves as a major power or strive for hegemony. We do not seek global dominance. China is not a hegemonic power. And this was China's official line until Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. That message was consistent for decades. This was the so-called Sino-American detente. Mao actually believed that if he shook hands with America, it would worsen relations between the US and the USSR. Back then, there were only three players on the global stage. Not Europe, not Japan. Just the USSR, China, and the United States. At the time, the US was cornered, completely isolated. It was bogged down in Vietnam and utterly humiliated. The country was on the verge of collapse. It got so bad that Mao said, "Looks like there's a revolution coming in the US. Let's wait and see if the revolution actually happens." That's how chaotic America looked at the time. Just when the world thought America was done, that it shook hands with China. So Mao's strategy was classic: use barbarians to control barbarians, let the Western powers fight each other. But then unexpectedly, the US and USSR improved relations. This was the art of triangular diplomacy. The USSR was already wary of NATO on its Western front, and now faced pressure from China, Korea, and Japan in the east. They feared encirclement from both sides. China, in turn, saw Soviet expansion as a threat to its own geopolitical interests. They had already considered aligning with the US, but when was that seed planted? Mao once adored the Soviets so much, he declared a one-track policy, a policy of unwavering loyalty to Moscow. We gaze only at Moscow day and night. We don't do equidistant diplomacy. So when did China flip? During the Korean War, Stalin refused to end the war and let China bear the brunt of the casualties. That really infuriated the Chinese. In 1969, along the Ussuri River, there were border clashes between the USSR and China. The Soviets quietly asked the US, "If we nuke China, will you stay out of it?" At a cabinet meeting, Nixon responded, "No way, we won't allow the USSR to attack China." He said it outright. And this was before any formal détente. Because it was a USSR-China conflict, it wasn't heavily covered by media, so it's little known. But it was intense behind the scenes. China, the giant, decided to ditch ideological ally Moscow and work with the US. They chose to co-manage the world with America. And this wasn't Deng Xiaoping, this was Mao himself. He had deep resentment and fear toward the USSR. Nixon regained lost influence from the Vietnam War by flipping the game board. He turned America's failing geopolitical chessboard into a Go board. You know how Go works if you've ever played it. An amateur can capture a few stones thinking they're winning, but turns out they're completely surrounded. The opponent has secured the entire center, and you're left with a few scraps around the edge, right? In chess, you destroy the king. That's game over. But in Go, you can lose a battle and still reshape the board. America changed the game from chess to Go. And it didn't do that from a place of strength. It was cornered. Look at how Brezhnev treated Nixon so friendly. He was all smiles, wasn't he? Originally, US diplomats advised against détente with China, fearing it would provoke the Soviets. They said, if we bring China into the fold, the USSR will retaliate. But the moment the US shook hands with China, the Soviets said, hey, let's be friends too. That's how much China and the USSR hated each other. Why? Because of geopolitical axioms. Why exactly? Aside from ideology. The US and China didn't have that much direct friction. But what was really in the way between China and the US? What was the biggest issue during the 1970s talks? They agreed in advance not to mention Taiwan. From Nixon and Mao's first meeting, they had a silent agreement, no Taiwan talk. Here's what Mao said: let's set Taiwan aside. It's a small issue. The world is big. Because sometimes, like how Dokdo Island becomes an obstacle in Korea-Japan relations, it's like when a Korean president says to a Japanese prime minister, it's fine, let's not make that an issue. Dokdo, it's small, in 100 years it'll be ours anyway. Let's freeze it for 100 years, status quo. That's basically what Mao said about Taiwan. Let's talk about it in 100 years. But what's between the USSR and China? A massive border, thousands of kilometers. So reconciliation, basically impossible. Between the US and USSR, there wasn't much direct friction either. But USSR and China, a long border means constant tension. That's why both the USSR and China wanted to befriend the US. So Nixon, humiliated in Vietnam, with Kissinger's secret diplomacy, flipped the entire geopolitical board. And suddenly it's go, not chess, and America has the most territory. Carter tried to return to idealism, but it didn't hold. Then Reagan came in and the USSR collapsed. Geopolitically, it was one of the most brilliant victories. It was like losing every inning, then hitting a grand slam in the ninth. And it wasn't through brute force, and they read the geopolitical map and flipped the whole board. The rule isn't to kill the king, it's to build more territory. That's how they flipped the paradigm. Now let's explore China's geopolitical logic. Geopolitically, China is an extremely harsh environment. This is one of the biggest differences between China and the US. The two countries are similar in many ways, in size, population, even ambition. But the fundamental difference lies in this. Geopolitically, China is surrounded by hell. Mao joined the Korean War, but he also went to war with India. That part deserves serious reflection. India led the Bandung Conference and basked in the spiritual legacy of Gandhi. Poor but revered, seen as morally untouchable. Many still think that way even today. Nehru embraced that image. He held the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. He said, "We can't develop because of the US and USSR. Let's unite as the third world, separate from the West and Japan." That was the Bandung spirit, led by Nehru. Nehru warmly embraced China at the conference. China was the invisible leader behind the scenes. See how Nehru smiles when meeting Mao. He thought China was a brother nation. But geopolitics knows no brothers. This area was uninhabited, desolate. The British drew the borders when they ruled India, and those arbitrary lines remain. But Mao envisioned Qing dynasty borders. The disputed area is the size of Fujian province. No one lived there, so China simply attacked Indian troops. And then they retreated. Nehru was so shocked, he died the following year. Essentially, death by shock. His whole worldview collapsed. He believed their suffering was caused solely by imperialists. Imperialists were the demons. He hoped that once imperialism was gone, communism or nationalism, it would build a peaceful world. That was his dream. And then, wait, China attacked us? Not imperialists? That shattered everything. Geopolitics is brutally cold. So how did it end? Nehru, who had always despised the US, sent an SOS. The US 7th Fleet deployed an aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal and said, "Make peace." And so they did. Vietnam defeated the United States, right? Then it set up a puppet regime in Cambodia and signed a defense pact with the USSR. Within just 2 or 3 months, China invaded. It was Deng Xiaoping's China. China is surrounded by enemies on all sides. So among all the countries bordering China, you can assume none of them genuinely likes China. People may differ, but no state truly does. That's China's geopolitical reality. No one likes China. It's been like that for a long time. Now China ended up completing America's Indochina strategy. Deng Xiaoping feared that Soviet-backed Vietnam would dominate Indochina. They're coming all the way down to Indochina. He thought, China is doomed if this goes on. It was genuine fear. Deng was naturally reclusive. He was purged twice during the Cultural Revolution. He was like a political weeble. He kept bouncing back. But as China's de facto leader, he took exactly one diplomatic trip abroad. This one. He visited Myanmar, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, then twice to Japan, and finally to the US. And what did he do after that? He attacked Vietnam. Why did he tour the region? To prepare for war. After that, he never traveled abroad again. He remained a reclusive ruler. At the time, the US was led by an idealist, President Carter. Deng sought help from Carter, but in a very Chinese way. He didn't ask for help. He simply said, "We're going to attack. Whether you approve or not, we're doing this. Just a heads up." Carter replied, "We can't help and we won't stop you. But according to our reconnaissance, We see no unusual Soviet troop movements near your border. That was a green light, wasn't it? Basically, go ahead. Because China was far weaker than the USSR, China attacked Vietnam as a proxy against the Soviets, same as Korea. North Korea was a proxy strike on the US. They couldn't hit the US directly, so they hit Korea. Likewise, they saw Vietnam as the Soviets and attacked accordingly. But they feared that if they hit Vietnam, the Soviets would hit them from behind. Carter reassured them that wouldn't happen. And here's the dark part. There's a country called Cambodia. It borders Vietnam. Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia. Remember, after Vietnam went communist, Cambodia followed. Then came the Khmer Rouge, truly one of the darkest regimes in history. They were monsters in human form. They destroyed everything civil, pure evil. They became so unbearable that Vietnam installed Hun Sen as a proxy. Vietnam's puppet regime ousted the Khmer Rouge. From a humanitarian view, the US should have condemned the Khmer Rouge because they created the killing fields. It was absolute carnage. Logically, the US should have supported Vietnam, but Deng Xiaoping was backing the Khmer Rouge because Vietnam was a Soviet proxy and the USSR was trying to use Vietnam to dominate the entire Indochina region. So Carter, a human rights-driven president, found himself indirectly supporting this monstrous Khmer Rouge regime. It was a moral paradox, and yes, support did happen. That's geopolitics, cold and unsentimental. Deng supported the Khmer Rouge because Vietnam was expanding across Indochina and acting as the USSR's right and left hand. That was his perspective. Carter didn't offer military aid, but he gave intelligence. Our satellites show no unusual Soviet troop activity. Go ahead and strike. Deng returned home and immediately launched the attack. He sent in 400,000 troops, it is signed, and reportedly lost more soldiers in a few weeks than the US lost in 10 years of war. China got absolutely wrecked, not Vietnam, but even though they lost the battle, the strategy still worked in China's favor. The USSR had promised to aid Vietnam militarily, like if anyone hits you, I'll hit them back. But then someone did get hit, and they just watched. They stood by, so what does that do? Where's their credibility? It was destroyed. They did nothing. So in China, what do they say about this? We touched the tiger's backside, and it didn't bite. You can imagine the tension, right? Sometimes that you've got to poke the tiger. You have to show the world you're still alive. But, hey, USSR, do you know how many friends I have? So Deng went on a global tour. Myanmar, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, the US. He always said one thing. We're going to strike Vietnam. Then he came home, and hit Vietnam's backside, which was really the Soviet Union's. And the Soviets did nothing. Let's look at a map. This is Vietnam. After Vietnam expanded like this, they installed a puppet regime in Cambodia. So Deng went to the US and said, Thailand is the last ally left in Indochina. It's in danger. You need to help me now. We'll do the attacking. You just stay quiet. That was the message. All the US did was provide intel. They're not moving. Soviets look quiet. Go for it. So Deng did. Vietnam eventually withdrew 10 years later. So what was Deng Xiaoping most afraid of? That the USSR would take all of Indochina, including Thailand, and ultimately the Strait of Malacca. Deng actually said this. They're trying to take the Malacca Strait. Today, the Strait of Malacca is China's chokehold. But it's not just China's problem, it's ours too. It's narrow, around 600 kilometers long, 100 kilometers wide. This narrow passage carries 25% of global trade. And 80% of China's oil passes through here. If it gets blocked, and it can for many reasons, sanctions, naval operations, anything. In 3 months, we couldn't flush toilets in Korea. Imagine a country where you can't use the bathroom. That's a nightmare, losing toilet access. You didn't know oil was tied to toilets, right? Apartments need power to pump water. No oil, no electricity, no water. Where would you go then? Into the woods? So yes, it matters deeply to us too. Right now, the US patrols the area with Singapore. Will the US ever stop those patrols? When the US was stuck in Indochina, the Soviets must have dreamed of controlling it. I'm not sure, but for Deng and China's leaders, this thought terrified them. The USSR was already harassing them at the border. And now they'd seize Indochina and the Malacca Strait too. This whole region leaned pro-Soviet. Even the Bandung Conference had Soviet sympathies. With so many leaning that way already, if the USSR extended its reach this far, they'd have total control over our life or death. That can't happen. So they decided to poke the tiger, attack. They had to tame the USSR. Even in weakness, China's instinct is to never submit to power, but instead try to dominate it. America was so shaken it avoided its Korean War mistakes, but they obsessed over it in Vietnam and failed again. They assumed China would intervene. China is formidable. As long as the US controls the Malacca Strait, China can't become a true superpower. Simply put, no Malacca sea walls, no superpower status. If the US blocks it, China dreams of digging a canal through Thailand. Let's cut a shortcut right here. But Thailand said no. And if China got along with India, maybe. But no, they don't. In this region, China loses to the Indian Navy. Could China's Navy even fight India here? And the US would quietly block them anyway. That means the Chinese Navy would have to bring everything with them. No local support. Navies don't just fight at sea. And China has no friendly ports here. India, they can dock anywhere on their own coast. No one here can match India. Geopolitically speaking, in Eurasia, without the US, India holds the strongest strategic position. We need good relations with India. In both land and sea, India dominates this region. Look closely at the map. This area isn't well connected by sea. It's blocked. No supply lines can reach here easily. And only India owns everything within range. If your ship breaks down on the way, India can stop anywhere and repair it. Others, if it breaks, they just sink. So what does China do? They build a port in Pakistan, Gwadar. It's a natural deep sea port. Big ships can dock there. They developed it and laid pipelines that run through Pakistan, Dotonen, all the way to Xinjiang in China. And the logic is this: China must secure Xinjiang. It's geopolitically critical for them. And so is Pakistan. So with this setup, even if the US blocks Malacca, even if India causes trouble, China can still deliver oil straight into Xinjiang. Some might say, can't China just get oil from Russia? That's geopolitically naive. Even during the Cold War, despite shared ideology, China trusted the US more than the USSR. Same for the USSR, they trusted Washington more than Beijing. This whole strategic game has been playing out under your radar. So through detente with China, then the US played Go, not chess, and eliminated the USSR. But once the Soviets fell, global stability unraveled. Why? Because the common enemy was gone. No enemy, meant no reason to cooperate. Somehow we muddled through. It's been a miracle. But now the US and China are heading for divorce fast. We didn't even know they were married. Turns out they were incredibly close. They even put the Korean Peninsula, America's blood-bound ally, on the negotiating table. That's how deeply the US and China shaped our modern era, and now they're getting a divorce. This era, marked by a US-China split, what opportunities and risks does it present for us? Wouldn't understanding that help us respond better? Still, it's a bit scary, isn't it? That's why China takes this very seriously. They think, wow, we need a way out, we must solve this. But is that possible? Maybe they can secure gas, but what about logistics? The Arctic route? Climate change is a variable now. So yes, the Arctic route is opening. That's why we need to think deeply about geography and geopolitics. You're probably wondering, how did we get here from Bitcoin? We'll start the Bitcoin discussion not next week, but the week after. We'll cover more on China and the monetary systems that shape the modern era. Even amidst conflict, they kept trading. Aren't you curious how they maintained global finance during all this? After that, we'll dive into the true meaning of Bitcoin and the role it could play in this geopolitical game. That's how we'll enter the final phase of the course. Thank you for staying with me through the lecture. See you next week.